President Cyril Ramaphosa has reiterated that South Africa is pursuing an independent foreign policy approach. He was speaking on the last day of the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, while the President of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, condemned the illegal sanctions imposed in his country. We discussed the highlights of the summit with Frontline Group CEO Dr. Jason Musyoka. Doc, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. So a lot was said by a number of African leaders at this summit. Let's focus on what we heard from the President of South Africa for now about the issue of exporting raw materials and how that needs to come to an end. Let's take a look, listen at this.
As nation states and as a continent, our substantial resources must be harnessed first and foremost for Africa's benefit, to grow Africa's economies and to pursue sustainable development. And as stated by others, we no longer want to be exporting ore, soil, and dusts and rocks from the minerals of our continent, but we want to be exporting finished products that have value. There must be respect also for what we do as countries, and we must stop those countries that count their wealth and their assets in terms of the minerals that reside in the African soil.
Dr. Musyoka, we've heard this before, that we need to reindustrialize, we need to export finished products. What has been the resistance?
So thanks so much, Dudu, for having me. I think that you rightly point out that these debates of equality and pushing through for a much more, forceful integration of agreements and international policy, I think that's 1990s. So there is really nothing new that we hear from industrializing. As a matter of fact, it's earlier than 1990s. If you go back to the 1950s, the beginning of the branch of economics referred to as development economics, you begin to see arguments about the need to increase the participation of value chains of as far as African states are concerned. So it's a very old debate. But I think the key issue here, of course, is a very veiled message that is being conveyed, but it masks the geopolitical tensions that are ongoing, the Cold War too, that we've clearly entered into. And I think that's where really the matters are. It's more than just the economics. The economics are, a camouflage or masking of the real political tensions that are beneath the surface.
What does that mean? Economics are a camouflage?
So if you look at the conversation, particularly around what the president is talking about, and perhaps to pick up a couple of issues from his speech. The one, he talked about African states being able to make independent foreign policy engagements. And then the second one, he cited South Africa's economic reconstruction and recovery policy, which is the post-COVID-19 economic policy for the country, and looking at ways in which South Africa could benefit in a world that is now clearly multipolar and difficult to navigate than it was before. So on that basis, when you hear these conversations around the exports and production and so on, the reality of the matter is that these are the same African states that are sitting with President Putin and applauding when he commits to send free aid to the continent. The historical literature clearly demonstrates that the aid has been not just delivered nothing as far as development is concerned, but it's also delivered negative development, which is we refer to as underdevelopment, as far as the West humanitarian aid to the continent is concerned. So the question perhaps is, why then is it okay for Russia to commit foreign aid to Africa and Africa is happy with that? Is this not really going to achieve the same consequences that we achieved in the 1980s with the Western humanitarian aid? So it's really on that point that in my assessment, I think that there is more than meets the eye here, because Russia, there is a very clear reason why Russia provided, for example, a number of helicopters. In the current summit, the commitment was made to provide presidential helicopter and several other military equipment and so on. It's clearly just a geopolitical issue here, because Zimbabwe is under sanctions and Russia wants to provoke the West more because of the intervention that they have in Zimbabwe. So it's not really just the economics of it. And that's the point I was trying to labor.
Okay. So we speak of exporting finished products. Why do we find ourselves having to import, because there's a lot being said about the war impacting food security and Africa being among the worst impacted continents. Why are we still finding ourselves importing food, importing fertilizer, when we have so much rich arable land, and there's so many countries, you can think of Kenya, that's doing such amazing work when we speak of fertilizers, and that's just about one example.
So one of the critical issues has been the governance systems in our continent, unfortunately, and the politics that are really not politics of development. And here in South Africa, we know that really is the case with the load shedding and much else in different other countries around the world. The politics is really the ultimate, and it's unfortunate because when you don't have a long-term planning for development, I know we have African Union Agenda 2063 now, which seeks to achieve development by then. The question, though, still is posed back to the nation states themselves on the strategies they have for their own development. And the question of exporting raw materials has a lot to do with technology and capital. And often we tend to invite Western powers to bring their technologies and their skills and so on. That has happened in the past, but even then, the debate has not yielded any fruit of ensuring that we participate in the value chains in a much broader way than we currently are. So it really is largely because of the dominance of politics in development conversations. And unfortunately, real scientific progress as far as technological advancement is concerned is never really achieved because we are caught in that cycle of political rhetoric around the continent, not just in one or two countries.
Yeah, you speak of participating in value chains. Let's take a listen at what President Cyril Ramaphosa had to say about financial institutions and the Security Council.
In this regard, the reform of the multilateral financial institutions, as well as the reform of the United Nations Security Council, remain a priority for us.
Dr. Musyoka, are we still talking about reforming these institutions years later? And taking a look at, for instance, we spoke to a former statistician general in South Africa, and he pointed to mainly why there's no economic growth in this country, is, amongst other things, is that we subscribe to the likes of the IMF and their projections and their recommendations. Is it not time for countries on the continent to map their own way forward?
So there are two dominant schools of thought within the African fraternity, African states, is the one school of thought which President Ramaphosa in South Africa largely subscribes to, at least on top government level, which is reforming these institutions. Then you have a more radical school of thought, Kenya, Rwanda, they've been pushing for that, and several other, Ghana as well. They've been pushing for not just reforms of these institutions, but an alternative and finding an alternative to these institutions. Russia, China, of course, has been really largely pushing for that as, looking for alternative to the IMF. And a lot of these African states that are more on the more radical side of that kind of school of thought, they then launch into Russia and China's orbit as far as this question of financial institutions are concerned. The reality is that these institutions, since 1949, since they were set up, they've also not really delivered. And I suppose as much as we are talking of reforms, one wonders whether they've really outlived their legitimacy and whether we should not be exploring new options. So it's a debate that oscillates between the reformists versus the radicals. And unfortunately, even in the continent, that fragmentation is not very helpful. It might be useful to find a convergence and push in one voice in terms of what's the way forward. But at the moment, it's a fragmented way forward.
Let's take a listen at what the president of Zimbabwe had to say about what his country is going through.
I wish, however, to highlight that Zimbabwe remains under illegal sanctions, which were imposed by some Western countries more than 2 decades ago, just because we had decided to reunite our people with its land. Notwithstanding this, my administration, guided by its policy of engagement and engagement, has chosen to be a friend to all and an enemy to none. But some countries have chosen to be our detractors in spite of that policy.
Dr. Musyoka, because the government of Zimbabwe decided to reunite its people with the land, they were slapped with sanctions. Again, how should we understand this sanctions mantra? Is Zimbabwe under sanctions, or are specific people under sanctions?
The country is hugely under sanctions, and that's why Russia is very keen to incite the West and provoke by providing free aid and helicopters and all of that. And so the sanctions are there. Unfortunately, also President Mnangagwa's administration has not been very helpful as far as democracy and development is concerned. As a matter of fact, democracy has deteriorated in that country, and the development is really almost on a sea level. So it's a very, very complex situation in Zimbabwe at the moment, and I don't think that there is very much of a legitimate voice from Zimbabwe. But that being said, there is still a proxy war being pushed through, because you have the IMF and European powers that insisted that now Mnangagwa needs to pay the former white farmers who Robert Mugabe took their land, and once that is done, then the country itself can be given some aid, some finances for development. So it's a quid pro quo from the West, and it's a very difficult one, because you are tying individual citizens to the country's future development prospects. And so it's a very murky situation in Zimbabwe. But as I said, that it doesn't help much that the administration itself, it has serious flaws as far as democracy within its own territories is really concerned.
Okay, let's take a listen at this where democracy is concerned.
We are scheduled to hold our harmonized general elections this year in August. International observers in individual countries are invited to send election observer missions to Zimbabwe. May I take this opportunity to reiterate that my government is ready to hold peaceful, free, transparent, fair and credible elections.
Is that legitimate, Dr. Musyoka?
No, clearly not. And if you look at just the recent law that was passed to criminalize anybody who is critical of government, that says a lot as far as the intentions of the forthcoming elections are concerned. So I think, unfortunately, the track record really speaks for itself. And also, importantly, there was, you might recall, the recent documentary, I think by Al Jazeera it was, that the president himself was implicated in a major gold scandal. And part of all of these issues, politicians, what they tend to do is to cling to power to protect the consequences of some of these actions. And so, in my assessment, I think, again, it's rhetoric, saying what the world would like to hear, but the reality on the ground is very different, even from Zimbabweans themselves.
This may be nothing, it may be something. Seated next to the president of Russia was the president of Zimbabwe. Memory fades now on who was seated to his other side. Does that matter, who has the proximity or who's closest to the king in this instance?
Yes, on a political level, with a political analysis, typically what really happens is seating arrangements are very symbolic. as far as particularly when you're dealing now with the geopolitics on a global level. So this clearly, as I said earlier, it's a way of President Putin, in my assessment, suggesting that Zimbabwe is our ally, Zimbabwe is our friend. Both of them are, of course, on huge sanctions. And President Putin even made a statement that one of the reasons why he revoked or recapitulated on the grains deal that was on the Black Sea port, he argued that most of the grain that was supposed to come to the continent, 70% of it went to the West and European companies. And he cited some of these countries, including Zimbabwe, and suggesting that these countries are suffering because Western capitalists sought to gain from the deal more than who it was intended to. So he was really playing into this rhetoric of the West, what West is doing in the continent, and particularly in Zimbabwe.
Frontline Group CEO Dr. Jason Musyoka, thank you very much for your time.